get started. So please, feel free to take more food, make yourselves at home. I'm going to introduce our amazing speaker, who is Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, and is a cardiologist, public health scientist, and director of the Food as Medicine Institute at the Freeman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. He's a distinguished professor, a dean emeritus, and John Mayer Professor at the Freeman School, as well as Professor of Medicine at the Tufts School of Medicine, and also an attending physician in cardiology at the Tufts Medical Center. So he's like all over public health, cardiology, medicine, and he has a very long bio that I'm not going to read, but I have to say he's extremely well-known and well-respected in the US and globally in the fields of food as medicine, nutrition, and public health, and also is a friend and colleague and partner that we work with very closely in our work on food as medicine and the food system more broadly. So before I turn it over to him, I'm going to let you clap for him in a moment. Before I turn it over, I just want to thank our co-sponsors. So the Food Law and Policy Clinic, especially Trevor Finley, who helped organize this event, as well as the Health Law and Policy Clinic, which is our sister clinic in the Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation, and the Food Law Society and Health Law Society. The plan for now is that we're going to have Dr. Mozaffarian give a lecture for a little bit. I'm going to ask him a few questions because I get to ask our questions that we have, and then we'll open it up for any of you who also have questions. So with that, join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you, Emily. Is my mic on? Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I used to come to Cambridge quite a bit more often. I was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for about 10 years before I got recruited to Tufts, and always nice to come over here. Beautiful, what a beautiful day. Let me fix this here. So I'm going to be talking about GLP-1 agonists, which I'm sure, assuming you're here, you've heard of these. Wegovy, Ozempic, these drugs that are sort of taking the world by storm. And it's just worth stepping back and talking about US obesity to start, and to realize that this is a new epidemic. And this is an epidemic that has not only happened in my lifetime, but happened in my adult lifetime. When I graduated medical school in 1995, there was no obesity epidemic in 1995. Like, it just wasn't a thing. And so this is really, really, really new. And so we sort of have to step back, and part of the conversation, hopefully part of the Q&A, will be why do we have an obesity epidemic that kicked off in 1990. The 1950s and 1960s and 1970s and 1980s were not a golden age of lifestyle, right? So what really changed? And I can actually tell you that physical activity has gone up since then. So it's not physical activity. It's really our food and nutrition. But let's look at the data. These are just charts of the proportion of adults in every state in the United States that have obesity. And you can see we were sort of around 10 or 15% of adults max in every state in 1990, not that long ago, right? And then just 5 years later, when I graduated medical school, as I mentioned, we're sort of up to sort of some states 15, 20%, most states still 10 to 14%, not, but a noticeable change. 10 years later, look 10 years later at 2005, now you have some states over 30%, and the vast majority of states over 20%. Dramatic change in just 10 years from 1995. And then you move forward, I don't know why that is missing. There's a lot more red. And it's missing on that screen too. So anyway, hopefully this won't happen in other slides. But in 2022, basically you have states over 40% obesity. And nationally we're at close to 40% obesity among adults. And so this at least shows 2022 by race. And you can see that dramatic, increase just even among non-Hispanic whites. The colors there, orange is over 30%, dark red is over 35%, and particularly also disparities among Black and brown Americans. And so GLP-1 agonists sort of entered this space, and it's interesting that the most effective, it shows us how little we understand the physiology of obesity, that the most powerful and effective drugs we've ever developed for obesity were not developed as obesity drugs. This was like an accidental side effect. These were developed as diabetes drugs, not as obesity drugs, because they have some effects on the pancreas, some effects on the stomach, and in animal models, they lowered blood glucose, and so people are like, oh, these could be great diabetes drugs. And so these are mostly developed and have actually been in use for at least 15 years, weaker versions of the drugs for diabetes. And then people noticed that even with these weaker versions, some people were losing weight. And so they started developing stronger versions, more powerful versions, longer acting versions to see if they could be developed for weight loss. And so what are GLPs? Glucagon-like peptide 1 is a naturally produced hormone. And again, going back to food, what's the natural thing that releases GLP-1? It's food. So GLP-1 is naturally released in the body. It's supposed to be released. It's positively released when you eat. And so GLP-1 agonist means it's activating the GLP-1. It's not an antagonist, it's an agonist. So GLP-1s activate the normal GLP-1 pathways, which normally are activated from eating and having release from the intestines. And what's so interesting about GLP-1s is that they're really one of the classical best examples, although there's many others, of how our gut is a massive endocrine system that influences every pathway in our body and interacts with our food and our microbiomes. And so GLP-1s influence the liver, the pancreas, the gastrointestinal tract, the heart, but especially for the obesity effects, the brain. There's lots and lots of effects in the brain. GLP-1s make people feel full, they make people feel less hungry, they make people feel satisfied. They also change the preference for foods and what foods people like. And so GLP-1s are a really interesting natural pathway. And so the drugs clearly work. On average, there's a pretty substantial weight loss. This is from one of the randomized controlled trials going out to 68 weeks, a little more than a year. There's about, on average, in the randomized trials compared to placebo, about a 15% loss of body weight. Now, that's a lot, but it also tends to flatten out, right? So people just don't keep losing weight. So on average, about 15%. What's interesting is some people don't lose any weight. They take the drug and they don't lose any weight. And some people take the drug and lose 30% of their body weight. So there's pretty dramatic differences. But on average, it's about 15%. And just one take-home message is these drugs by themselves are not going to solve the obesity epidemic, because 1 in 11 adults weighs over 300 pounds in the United States right now. And so if on average we have 15% weight loss, we get from 350 to 300 or 300 to 270, that's great. That's great for their health. We're still going to have a lot of obesity in this country with an average 15% weight loss. But that plateauing is quite important, and we'll get back to that. And of course, there's been crazy public response and demand for these drugs. The stock prices of Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, which are the two companies that have approved drugs in this field, tripled in 2 years. Tripled. These are like 100-year-old companies. Their stock prices tripled, and Novo Nordisk is now worth more than the annual GDP of its home country of Denmark. So Novo Nordisk has become the most valuable country in all of Denmark, in all of Europe. Now, the list prices in the US are quite high, $12,000 to $16,000 per year, and so if you pay cash for the actual original drug, like that's the cost. But there's steep manufacturer discounts, and so they all kind of negotiate discounts. Those usually aren't publicly disclosed, so we don't know the exact amounts. But from all the evidence that can be gained, it's about probably $7,000 per year for these drugs. Now, there's this, when I've talked to so many policymakers and doctors and others, like, oh, the prices are going to come down, the prices are going to come down. They're going to come down a little bit, but they're not going to come down a lot. And even as these drugs eventually become cheaper, there's going to be newer ones, combination drugs, that are going to be more expensive. We've seen this with every other drug class that's made. Pharmaceutical companies keep doing things to preserve their profits. So for example, the current drugs have an average of 20 patents, many to 2040 and beyond. And so they have no incentive to dramatically lower their costs anytime soon. So they're going to stay around at least $500 a month, $6,000 a year, I think, for many years. And this is really expensive. I mean, there's lots of other expensive drugs. There's some drugs, like, for example, to cure hepatitis C, where like a single dose can cost $1 million. So there's some really expensive drugs out there, and some genetic drugs for curing, diseases that are in that range. But, a handful of people need those drugs. Here we have a case where pretty much every American adult qualifies for these drugs. If you look at body weight, blood pressure, blood cholesterol, and blood glucose, kind of the 4 metabolic risk factors, and we've published on this, 14 out of 15 adults in the United States has abnormal levels of one or more of those things. Just for body weight, 100 million Americans meet the criteria. For more than half of adults, about half of adults, meet the eligibility criteria for weight loss alone. And so even with the discounted rate, we're talking about $600 billion to treat those 100 million people. And how much do we spend on all other prescription drugs combined? $600 billion. So we're talking about doubling our national pharmaceutical spend on a single drug, right? Which is absolutely impossible. So it's economically impossible to prescribe these drugs. It's economically impossible. And they're not only not cost savings, they're not even cost effective. Cost effective is, how much value do you get for the dollar you spend in healthcare? They're definitely not cost savings. Even accounting for all the costs of obesity, the drugs are much, much too expensive to be cost savings. They're not even cost effective. And what do I mean by cost effective? As I mentioned, almost nothing in healthcare saves money. If what we did in healthcare saved money, we wouldn't spend $5 trillion on healthcare in this country. Vaccines save money. A few other, very inexpensive preventative things might save money. But blood pressure screening and control doesn't save money. Cholesterol screening and control doesn't save money. Cancer screening and control doesn't save money. Mammograms don't save money. Prostate, none of those things save money. You get a decent buy for your dollar. You gain health. We're buying health, but you don't save money. But these drugs, they're not only not cost savings, they're not cost effective. Very, very expensive for the health gains. And that's a widely misunderstood thing about these drugs, that they're somehow cost savings. Now, the other big problem with these drugs is that not everybody can take them. Yeah.
I have a question about the cost effectiveness of these drugs, because many people who market these drugs, they say, okay, if you have this, you lose weight, but after 10 years you will be saving the cost of your diabetes drugs, hypertension drugs.
Yeah, all that's accounted for, and they're not cost savings. They're not even cost effective. If you account for all of that downstream savings, because of all, if you take 100 million Americans with obesity, how many are going to develop diabetes? How many are going to develop heart attacks? How many are going to develop other complications? Take 15% weight loss, subtract all those things, take the cost of the drugs into account. They're not even close to cost savings, and they're not even cost effective, accounting for all the downstream lifetime benefits that you might get. That's been studied many times. Yeah, and again, that's like even with the obesity being so expensive, they're not eliminating obesity, and they're also very expensive. So the other problem, though, which is an even bigger problem, is that not everybody can stay on these drugs, and so there's many side effects. About 40 or 50% of people have very severe gastrointestinal side effects. Although usually, if you stay on the drug, you can get through them. There's also muscle and bone loss. Now, the muscle and bone loss is not unique to these drugs. Any rapid weight loss, you'll lose body fat, you lose body muscle, you lose bone, you lose everything. Everything goes down at once if you're not doing an active lifestyle training program to preserve muscle and bone loss. But the problem is, it happens so rapidly, you can lose maybe 20% of your muscle in just a year and a half. And then most people don't stay on the drug. That's the fundamental problem. Most people don't stay on the drug. In real life data sets, only about 25% of people prescribed the drug are still on it at 1 year. So 75% of people go off the drug. And what happens, this is from a randomized trial, the red line is when treatment stops, the weight rapidly comes back almost to baseline. And since they've lost muscle and bone, they're not regaining muscle and bone, they're regaining fat. And so it actually could be worse off and have worse health after the weight regain. So this is a real problem. Like if you were building something to bankrupt the US economy, this would be almost like a perfect thing to do it. Everybody's eligible for it. It causes immense weight loss. Most people go off it, and then you regain the weight. So you've spent money, and people are not healthier at the end of the 2 years. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if it's been rigorously studied, but I think from just all first principles and everything we know, it's overwhelmingly people just go back to their usual lifestyle, and so that's what I'm going to get to. The problem with these drugs is they're just being prescribed without any wraparound lifestyle counseling, right? In the vast majority of cases, and I'll get to that in a second. The other thing to note is in the real world, as opposed to the randomized trials, even the people that stay on the drug, they don't get 15% weight loss. They're getting around 9 or 10% weight loss. And this isn't even compared to placebo. This is just so in the real world also, you're not getting this 15% benefit. You're getting smaller benefit. And so what's happened now is because of all of these challenges and costs, there's rationing. That's really been the answer. So Medicare, there's no coverage for obesity, although there is coverage for heart disease, sleep apnea, kidney disease, all these other indications, but no coverage for obesity. But that's basically, again, being sort of worked around by the drug companies. Medicaid has limited coverage determined by the states. Commercial plans started covering them and realized what they were spending and that they're not going to save money, and they've mostly stopped covering them or given lifetime caps. And then there's a lot of startup companies that have popped up in healthcare to try to basically say, if you're a commercial plan or you're a state and you have people who are eligible officially, send them to us, and roughly 10% of them will get a GLP-1, and 90% of them will shift and do other things that aren't as effective and save you money, net save you money. And so they're basically rationing. And so I think that this is a challenge, because we ultimately don't want to ration these drugs. We want to use them wisely and effectively. And especially if we ration them, we're going to increase disparities. People who want them the most or can pay for them will get them the most. And so what we really have to do, which gets back to the last question, is use these drugs with comprehensive wraparound lifestyle therapy. And we have a paper coming out hopefully next month from 4 of the major clinical societies that study and treat obesity, really going through an expert view of what we need to do in real life for these drugs, which is actually talk to patients about their lifestyle before they go on the drug, make sure they have a robust nutrition program, make sure they have a robust strength training program, keep them on those programs while they're on the drug, and then especially when they go off the drug, because some people will go off the drug and they may even want to go off the drug, this can help support them and just keep their weight maintained at the end. And this is not happening in real life. And so I see patients at Tufts Medical Center in Chinatown, and I had a patient come to me, I can't remember if it was end of December or beginning of January, but just a couple months ago. First time he's been in cardiology. His primary care is outside at another clinic. Had a BMI of like 36, which is quite above obesity. His hemoglobin A1C was close to 12, which is almost double normal. Very, very sick, and he had been put on a GLP-1 by his primary care doctor, very appropriate. And so his wife was on the mobile phone, on the speakerphone, and so we started talking. I said, so what do you do for nutrition? What did your doctor talk to you about? And she said, oh, he didn't really talk to me about it. And I go, how's your nutrition? He goes, it's pretty good, it's pretty good. And his wife on the speakerphone says, tell him about the Coca-Cola. And he's like, oh yeah, I drink Coca-Cola. And I was like, how much do you drink? He's like, about 12 cans a day. And so he's drinking 12 cans of Coca-Cola a day, and he's on GLP-1. And I'm like, did your doctor talk to you about that? He said, no. Right? So like, this is a real life example of someone I just saw, and this is like really what happens in medical care, right? Doctors prescribe a drug and just send patients on their way. And so this is where I think food is medicine, and I lead the Food is Medicine Institute, is really important. We should be integrating food into healthcare, prescriptions for healthy food. You can give a $50 a month prescription for healthy food as opposed to a $500 a month prescription for GLP-1s. You can give medically tailored meals, medically tailored groceries, nutrition counseling, and this is already happening. It's actively happening in Massachusetts. Chilpy does a lot of excellent research on this and a lot of support for states and organizations doing this. This is a really interesting intersection, and I think GLP-1s are actually wind beneath the sails of food as medicine. And so we've proposed in a commentary, and we've also proposed to some randomized trials for research funding to actually test this approach, that really what we need to do is put this together, put GLP-1s and food as medicine together. And I'm guessing like roughly a third of patients, once they're on the GLP-1 for a year, they've lost their weight, they could probably go off the drug and never need it again and be on food as medicine and lifestyle and do great. Roughly another third probably will need some kind of boosters every few years. They might need to go back on because they slowly regain the weight, but much more slowly. And then maybe a third will just fail food as medicine and fail lifestyle and maybe need the drug long term. This would save hundreds of billions of dollars and would actually integrate food and nutrition into healthcare. So I just want to end with a couple points. So first, you can naturally stimulate your GLP-1, and there's not a lot of research on this because there's not a lot of research funding for nutrition, but these, in mostly animal studies, some human studies, natural healthy fats, avocados, nuts, flaxseed, olive oil are one of the biggest things that stimulate GLP-1s naturally. Prebiotic fibers that nurture the microbiome stimulate GLP-1, and more importantly, not only stimulate GLP-1, but generate short-chain fatty acids and other microbial metabolites that positively interact with GLP-1 in the brain and potentiate GLP-1 in the brain. Eggs and some other protein sources activate GLP-1. And then artificial sweeteners, added sugars, and saturated fat seem to blunt production. So it's quite interesting and powerful that the same things we've seen associated with better body weight and less obesity seem to be associated with GLP-1s. And then I just want to end with, I think one of the, to me, maybe the most interesting thing about GLP-1s is not actually all of the stuff about cost and side effects and dollars and body weight, but what it's really fundamentally taught us about what the normal human desire for food should be. And so this doesn't happen all the time, but for many patients on GLP-1s, they go on GLP-1s, it's not just that they're less hungry, their preference for food dramatically changes. And this is from a really nice New York Times Magazine article. I'd recommend you to read it. These are different patients that they talk to. So I just want to read them. Like this is what the reporter who was talking to these patients. He took us straight past the Doritos without a side glance at the Oreos or the Cheetos. We rushed past the Pop-Tarts and Hershey's Kisses, Lucky Charms and Lay's. We arrived at his happy place, the produce section. I ate a lot of pineapple, cucumber, ginger. His daughter fed him some candy. I just couldn't. It was so sweet it choked me. My whole life was fast foods. Now the first place I hit when I get to the store is produce. My favorite is Mount Rainier cherries, apples, peaches, pears. Celery tastes like celery, carrots taste like carrots, strawberry tastes like strawberry. Since taking a GLP-1, she said, I just started to realize that they taste wonderful by themselves. A Hostess Ho-Ho no longer seems like food, she said. It tastes plasticky, feels plastic in my mouth. This is how I feel about food every day. Like, junk food tastes terrible. It really tastes terrible. It tastes awful. Like, Doritos taste horrible. I think my whole life I felt that way because I think somehow, naturally, fortunately, I've had the microbiome and the genetics and the lifestyle to have natural GLP-1 function. I think people who like healthy food have natural GLP-1 function. And I think we have an overwhelming nation of GLP-1 deficiency and or resistance. Deficiency, we're not producing it, or resistance, it's not having its effects in the brain. Very analogous to diabetes. Diabetes is a challenge of insufficient insulin production and insulin resistance. We have a nation of GLP-1, 70-80% of our country. And I think what's so fascinating is all that the GLP-1s are showing us is that if the natural human desire is for healthy, minimally processed food. And so all this stuff about the industry hooking us on like salt, sugar, and starch and all this stuff that we can't resist it because we're hardwired for it is completely false. We are hardwired for healthy food. And what's happened in the last 30, 35 years with changes to our microbiome and our metabolism and our epigenetics and early life influences is we've created this country where we're gaining weight without increasing our caloric intake, which we can talk about, by the way. In the last 20 years, our caloric intake has not gone up. And so I think GLP-1s are really a window into what the normal human physiology would be like. And if we can figure out how to normally return us back to a normal GLP-1, like we were in 1980, right, we can actually reverse the obesity epidemic without even the drugs. So thanks for your time and happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Do you want to join me up
Yeah.
here and I'll ask you? Okay. All right, I'm gonna ask like 2 quick questions. I have a whole bunch, but I'm gonna just ask 2 because I feel like you probably all do too, and I know some people ask. I'm gonna ask that when we open it up to questions from you, if you can use the microphone that we're gonna bring around, that would be great because we're recording this and the ceiling mics aren't on, so only the microphones are going to get picked up. Okay. All right. Thank you. It's fascinating. I love, just the way you're thinking about this also, and both contributing to the commentary on it and the research on, how this fits into like a broader ecosystem. So I'm going to ask you a couple of things. I think one big one, and you sort of where you ended a little bit on, this is obviously changing what people are asking for. So I guess my main question is now there's all the companies are sort of food companies are saying we're going to change our food in this, that, and the other way. So for example, the head of ConAgra recently said it's really a matter of helping people understand we're here for you and we've got a truckload of solutions to help you achieve your goals and stay on target. Nestle has a pre-meal hunger support nutritional drink and lots of new foods being produced. Is that part of the solution or is that part of, how do you see that fitting in besides just people changing what they want? And is there a way to make that also like a broader change? Yeah,
so Nestle has sort of spun off a line called Vital Pursuits, which is a spin-off of Lean Cuisine, which is for people on GLP-1s and other things. So if the spin-offs are minimally processed, healthful, nourishing foods, that's terrific. They say, hey, we're going to have more demand for that. But I think the majority of them won't be because those are more expensive, harder to make, harder to store. And so I think, what the same article, the same New York Times Magazine article, the second half of the article goes into what food companies are doing, and they're basically trying to manipulate artificial flavors and colors and things to like stimulate people, like getting taste tester panels of people on GLP-1s, and so to create ultra processed foods with additives and starch and sugar and all the same problems that just taste better to them. Now, I don't know if they'll be successful. That'll be really interesting. Now you're going to have a battle between the biology of GLP-1s and manufacturers and technology. I don't know how successful they'll be, but I think I'm skeptical. I'm hopeful, but I'm skeptical. So I think we need more policy solutions to make healthy food the norm. And those policy solutions are in healthcare, they're in the federal nutrition programs, they're in public health and regulation, they're in science, they're in federal coordination, they're in entrepreneurship and innovation. We've written about this, as you know. I mean, you worked with us on this before. We have kind of a suite of policy solutions. And just as one example, if we just rely on the market alone, this will never happen. But the government has always prioritized certain industries for national security reasons. And so the railroads or the auto industry, clean energy, we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars in this country trying to increase clean energy. China's done it with batteries. We've done it with solar, wind. Imagine if all the governments of the world did is said, oh, clean energy is good, stop using oil and gas. Nothing would have happened, right? And so similarly for food, we need to have massive investment into business innovation and entrepreneurship to help support companies that want to make healthier food. It's basically like starch and sugar are the coal and gas of the food system, and fruits and vegetables and beans and nuts and seeds and legumes and yogurt are the solar and wind and other clean energy. And so we have to use the power of the government to help the companies shift. I think if we do both, I think we could actually transform the food system. Yeah.
And maybe adding on to that with something else we've written about together, which is about the additives in food. So you mentioned the additives. So we know like the sugar and starch or the coal. There's also a whole bunch of additives that are poorly regulated, and I don't want to take us down that whole path, but like at the same time also getting a better handle on that piece. Another thing that I know you've worked on and we've worked on jointly as well has been around the doctors you talked about. So you talk about this patient who comes in, they're on GLP-1s, their doctor doesn't know anything, hasn't talked to them about what they eat. Do you want to talk a little bit about in your own training, I mean, how you brought the food side into your training as a physician and like where you think that needs to play in? And I think I know what you're going to say, but I want you to say.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I mean, I was lucky to go to top medical and training institutions around the country, and 4 years of medical school, 3 years of internal medicine, 4 years of cardiology, so 11 years of training. And in all that training, I learned nothing about nutrition. And we learned about vitamin K and enzymes and clotting factors and vitamin E and deficiency diseases and how it works molecularly. But true nutrition of like guiding people or chronic diseases, we learned nothing about it. And so that was the start of my own journey. As I said, I need to learn this myself, because I could tell, and we've since quantified, that the top issue facing my patients was their food, and I wasn't learning about it. So that was like the first big realization to me, that the top issue facing my patients in health isn't covered in the healthcare system. And then the second realization was, this was in the late 90s when I started reading the science myself. Even in the late 90s, at the height of the low-fat, fetish in this country, the evidence didn't support a low-fat diet. Even in the 90s, it supported a high healthy fat, minimally processed, Mediterranean or Okinawan style, however style you want to say, diet was clear in the 90s. And none of our dietary guidelines said that. None of our policies were talking about that. And so that was the second big realization, that even what the science we have isn't being translated to policy. And so that's kind of led to my career journey. And I think that what's exciting now is with the GLP-1 drugs and with food as medicine as a tool, as a prescription, there's actually a reason for doctors to learn about nutrition. They're going to have to do it to support GLP-1 users, otherwise we're going to go bankrupt. They're going to have to do it to prescribe food as medicine. And you know this, many polls have shown that doctors at all levels of training, 90% of doctors want to know more about nutrition, don't think they know enough, feel bad that they don't know enough, and wish that nutrition training was mandatory. And so I think that it has to happen. And right now, you're going to hear in the news like, oh, Stanford has a culinary medicine clinic, or Emory has this. They're like Band-Aid fixes. It's an elective, like 10 students take it, it's fun. but it's not integrated into the curriculum. And so you've written about this, really, really well. We need to change the tests. We need to change the accreditation standards. Imagine if the bar didn't have 10% of questions on something that was really important, you wouldn't learn it, right? But if the bar had 10% of questions on something really, it's the same thing with the test. So we have to change the test, change the accreditation standards to make 5-10% of medical training be about food and nutrition.
I love that. And I think it's a good plug too for those thinking about working with us. This is something we work on a lot within the clinic on like the policy side of this. And it's been fascinating collaborating with our like legal knowledge and tools across the aisle with, well, not across the aisle, but with the other discipline of, doctors, physicians, and those in the public health field to say, all right, they know what's missing and we know like, where's the money? Follow the money, follow the trail of like who's paying for that and where the accreditation happens. I'm going to ask you one more and then I'm going to open it. I guess like this might be a hard one to put you on the spot, but just, so one big thing that happened as far as Medicare, Medicaid coverage of GLP-1s was at the end of the Biden administration, Biden said, we're going to propose to have a rule that these be covered by Medicare, Medicaid. And then just this week, this administration said they're not going to take that approach. And I guess I'm curious your thought on that, do you think they should be? Do you think in some ways not doing it now like buys time to get a more integrated response? Or what's your take on that? Like what do you say?
So the reason they're not covered is because 10, 20 years ago when obesity drugs weren't very effective, they were sort of it was seen more as a cosmetic issue. There was just a specific rule that said, anti-obesity medications aren't covered by Medicare, and that just that's a cosmetic thing, and they're not very effective, and so on. Now we have a different, drug. So first of all, like it's almost becoming irrelevant because by law in the United States, if a drug is approved by the FDA for an indication other than anti-obesity medications, it has to be covered by Medicare. There's no ability of Medicare to think about cost or what's going to happen. They just have to do it. And so these drugs, because of their effect on weight loss, lower cardiovascular risk in people with cardiovascular risk. So they have an approved indication for anybody at cardiovascular risk. They reduce sleep apnea, which is a breathing problem among people with obesity, among people with sleep apnea. They reduce kidney function decline among people at risk for kidney function decline. They, of course, reduce diabetes risk among people with diabetes. So all of those indications are approved, and Medicare is now covering them. And so if you add cardiovascular risk, kidney function risk, sleep apnea, and diabetes, you're getting like at least 60%, 70% of people with overweight and obesity already. Mm-hmm. So they're basically, and there's many, many more trials coming. There's trials coming around alcoholism and smoking because basically these same pathways are kind of the addiction centers of the brain. There's trials around depression that are coming up, and I'm sure for the majority of people who have obesity and are depressed, if they lose weight and feel better and eat better, they're going to feel less depressed. So I think it's actually kind of moot, really, because the drugs are just going to be used otherwise.
On that, there was an op-ed, I think yesterday, from Senator Fetterman about, I guess he's taking, I don't remember which drug for stroke, but he was like, I feel so much better. Like, I sleep better, I feel better. Like, it has like all these other effects on sort of health and wellness. So I think, that'll be interesting. I could go on. I'm going to open it up. And if it's slow, I'll ask some questions. But I would love if people can use the microphone just so we can get you on as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I thought it was interesting how you talked about the share price of Novo Nordics and the market forces that are influencing the rise of these drugs. I think there's maybe a similar story around what affects what food is available to people. Can you sort of, in light of the idea of your approach is sort of bring whole foods back into the conversation, and the fact that this epidemic affects poor and working class people disproportionately, what is the way forward given how our resources are arranged in the food system?
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot and written about this a lot. I'm actually writing a book about this called, so far, Food is Medicine, so stay tuned, maybe by the end of the year it'll be out, and kind of go through this in more detail. But basically the food system we have was created to address calories and vitamins, because those are the priorities of the 20th century. We learned about vitamins in the 1920s and 1930s and learned about vitamin deficiency diseases, and there was a world war and famine and school lunch program and all this stuff to get vitamins to people. And then we had a population explosion where we didn't have enough food to feed the world. The population quadrupled in the 20th century from about 1.5 billion to 6 billion. And if you just did the math in the 1940s, we just couldn't feed the world with the acreage that we had, and that led to the Green Revolution, monocropping of wheat and soy and rice and corn, pesticides, water irrigation, intensive irrigation, all to produce calories for the world, which was very successful. We 10x'd production per acre, 10x in like 10 years with the Green Revolution. And so the food system we have was built to create cheap, starchy, vitamin-fortified calories, because that was the goal of the 20th century. And so when you walk down the Walmart aisle and you see all these cereals, they were not entirely a nefarious plot. They were really, again, those goals. And so what we missed was that in doing so, we were creating sort of products that were stripped of their natural phenolics and fibers and natural cell structure and biodiversity and other things that we need for a healthy diet. And so the real drivers, economic drivers now, of our food system is that everything we've done for the last 50, 60 years has been to have cheap, available calories for the world. We've consciously built systems for that. The supply chain systems, the crop systems, everything has been to develop that. And now, of course, you have a lot of legacy companies who have become very rich in that system. So you definitely have to follow the money, and this is the Willie Sutton rule, right? The Willie Sutton, the bank robber who got arrested in the 30s. He was kind of a folk hero, and they said, "Why do you rob banks?" He said, "Because that's where the money is," right? That's the sort of the Willie Sutton rule. And a lot of people talk about the farm subsidies, and the farm subsidies are $17 billion in crop insurance that don't actually reduce the price of those crops. No farmer supports anything that reduces the price of his crops. So they don't actually reduce the price of the crop. The real money is in healthcare. It's $5 trillion. In our federal nutrition programs, which are $170 billion, 10 times the farm subsidies. At the NIH, which is $50 billion. And in other major government programs, and in private capital and private investment. And so we absolutely have to follow the money. And so what we have to do is integrate nutrition into healthcare, which is food as medicine, which is, again, $5 trillion. Like, that's the elephant in the room. We have to shift our federal nutrition programs, which are $170 billion, a massive handout to the food industry, direct handout to the food industry, to be sure they're paying for healthy food. We have to shift NIH, which is $50 billion, so that a lot of that goes to really effective nutrition research. And then we have to develop a government program to engage the venture capital and business innovation and entrepreneurship, where a little bit of government support builds this kind of private sector industry. That's where all the money is. The farm subsidies, which I don't know if your question was intimating at those, are pretty minimal and kind of trivial compared to all of that. So we do have to reconfigure the food system. We do have to do it to make companies that do the right thing profitable win. Like, that's the only way we're going to fix this. We're not going to fix this in any other way. We have to use the market forces for good, rather, just the same way we've done for solar and wind and other things. Yeah.
Maybe I'll add one thing on that, just because you mentioned food as medicine, but maybe not everyone in here, and it's something as well we work on really a lot in both the Food Law and Policy Clinic and Health Law and Policy Clinic, is really the nuts and bolts of how do states cover this. But it's really about, for patients that are low income, that have certain conditions, providing actual food as well as education for them to try to make it easier for them to access the foods that they really need. And so I think that also gets to this point of, it's really directly targeting this equity concern about who has access to the right foods, who knows how to eat them. We talked about doctors' lack of nutrition, but it's also the general public. I mean, I think most people, can go through all of your years of education and really have no substantive education about food and nutrition in a way that's really actionable and helpful, especially if you're living on a budget and that kind of thing. So.
Yeah. Healthcare is a third of the federal budget and a fifth of our national economy, dwarfs any other segment. And so using some of those dollars for food prescriptions, particularly for people with social needs or other needs and diet-related disease conditions, is what food as medicine is, and what's really exciting. And it historically, healthcare has not paid for food because it's not been considered a medical therapy, which is kind of crazy. But there's been two things that have changed that slowly over time. One was the Ryan White Act, which was passed in the 80s by Ted Kennedy, actually, here in Massachusetts. Ryan White was a young kid with hemophilia who got HIV and then AIDS and died. And at that time, there was nothing you could do for patients with AIDS. There were no treatment. So there was a Ryan White Act, which let you give people basically, palliative care, including meals. And so a bunch of nonprofits sprung up around the country, like Community Servings here in Boston, which you should all visit. Community Servings is amazing, which sprung up to give people healthy food while they were dying. And over the years, as by the late 90s, there was triple drug therapy, and it kind of turned HIV from a death sentence into kind of a chronic disease. And so these agencies started saying, well, let's look at other people who are really sick. And they started looking at cancer and diabetes and end-stage kidney disease. And they found not only were they helping them feel better, they were actually making them better, and they were keeping out of the hospital and saving money. And so that was kind of one route. And then the other route was more on the food security, anti-hunger community started giving like double up bucks for SNAP or for WIC or for other programs to help people buy fruits and vegetables rather than having to buy processed food. And that they started seeing, again, health benefits. And so these two streams of produce prescriptions and medically tailored meals have now fully entered the healthcare arena in demonstration projects around the country. So 16 states have food as medicine through Medicaid right now. Most commercial health plans are testing food as medicine. We're trying to get Congress to pass a bill to enter food as medicine into Medicare, and Chilpi is as well. So it is a really exciting time, I think, where my hope is in 5 years, it'll be normal for you to come to a doctor and they can prescribe healthy food, and it's paid for by your insurance. Yeah.
Other questions?
And sorry, what time do we go to so I know how short to keep
We
my
probably have like 7 minutes.
Okay, I'll keep my answers short.
When you talked about the wheel of like what an effective GLP-1 plus lifestyle intervention would look like, there's a lot on there that looked like it could cost a lot, but I think you kind of implied that that would still be more that would be cost effective, whereas GLP-1s are not. But then in your first response, you also mentioned you can't just leave the market to do this. So I'm wondering, if it is cost effective, why aren't the health insurance companies and the startups going after that if there is money there?
Yeah. So I think it will happen, and it's new. And so I said right now the startups are rationing as their major goal, and they are doing a little bit of behavioral stuff, but healthcare just doesn't know how to do it. It's just never been done. It's just not been done to have wraparound lifestyle, to have a strength coach, to have educational counseling. And if you did all that one-on-one, it would actually be pretty expensive. But there's more and more asynchronous, digital, group-based therapy. Not everybody needs a one-on-one coach. Some people need an app. Some people need a video. And so we just haven't built those systems yet in healthcare. And so I do think that GLP-1s provide the opportunity to make those systems built. And so that wheel is kind of the roadmap of what needs to happen. And now we have to have the sector operationalize it, I think. And so again, it's a very interesting time where you have this really, I mean, I'm not against GLP-1s. I hope that's clear. I think they're good drugs and should be used. We shouldn't be rationing them. We should be using them wisely. And I think if we use them wisely, it will cost so much, it will put appropriate pressure to figure this out. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My question is about the muscle loss. We see a high percentage of muscle loss with all weight loss methods, but this one is really fast. So when I searched for a solution, I found only increasing protein intake and resistant training. Do you think there is like a more sustainable way? Because like it's easy to tell patients to do this, but they don't from the behavioral aspect. So do you see any way to solve this challenge, especially when something like the Ozempic phase, there is a lot of muscle loss?
Yeah. So you just one correction. You see a similar muscle loss with any rapid weight loss, but slow weight loss you don't actually see a lot of muscle loss. If you lose weight slowly, like a pound a month, 2 pounds a month, you don't actually see it. So it's only with any rapid weight loss you see muscle loss. Protein intake by itself does not prevent muscle loss. So that should be very, very clear, and we sort of summarize this. And actually, just if you take home anything from this talk, like the country now has gone from this low-fat fetish to this high-protein fetish. I don't know why everybody's like protein, protein, protein. If you're not resistance training, you don't build muscle by eating protein. Like who do you know that eats protein and that comes back with big muscles, right? And so this goes back to, I don't know if it's high school biology or medical school biology, but if you have amino acids circulating in your bloodstream and your muscles don't need them because you're not strength training, guess what happens to them? They get turned into fat. Just like starch gets turned into fat, just like sugar gets turned into fat. And so people who have higher protein intake have higher risk of diabetes in the United States. So we have this crazy idea that everybody's eating protein thinking this is a good thing, and they're actually just creating visceral fat and diabetes risk for protein. Insulin goes up when you eat protein to deal with it. So protein intake by itself won't work either. You have to do strength training. You have to do resistance training. So that's the only way to do it. And until there's some new drug like GLP-1s that activate those same pathways, and maybe there will be in the future. But so far, you have to do protein intake plus strength training. And whether we can get healthcare to pay for that, which dramatically improves quality of life and other things, is a whole different question. But we have to figure out how to make that more of a reality.
One more short question, maybe, there. Sorry, Trevor.
Hi, thanks for being here. I just wanted to ask something top of mind because I feel like every time you turn on the TV, whether it's streaming or cable, you're seeing one, GLP-1 ads or junk food, fast food ads. And I'm curious, to reorient our taste buds back to whole foods as it's meant to be, do you see marketing playing any role? And if any, how do we make whole foods, fruits, vegetables sexy?
Yeah, so the challenge in the United States, which is fairly unique across the world, is the First Amendment precludes, as you guys know better than me, probably any restrictions on marketing that isn't deceptive. And so the only hope we have to regulate marketing is for kids under 8 or under 5, where we can make the case that advertising is deceptive because they can't discern the difference between advertising and programming. So I do think the FTC should act and ban marketing in all forms to kids under 5 or under 8. Other than that, especially with this Supreme Court, who really likes commercial speech, there's no way we're going to do anything regulatory about food marketing. So I think this gets back to making it profitable, right? We have to probably make it profitable. How do we make it profitable? We take existing streams of money that are massive streams of money in the economy, and we shift them to healthy food. The biggest stream is healthcare. The second biggest stream is our federal nutrition programs, in particular SNAP. And then we add research, we add grants from Treasury, tax breaks, other things, and we make it profitable. If we make it profitable, then it'll be marketed. And then you create a virtuous cycle where farmers want to grow the food, farmers make more profits, prices will go down because there's more demand and there's more scale. Right now we have the opposite of the virtuous cycle. We have everybody going to the lowest common denominator of the cheapest ingredients. It makes us sicker, drives up healthcare spending, which is suffocating every other priority for families, for businesses, for the government. And then it keeps just cycling worse and worse and worse. Less money for infrastructure, less money for education, less money for everything. And so we got to reverse that cycle. Healthier food systems, healthier farms, lower healthcare spending, more dollars to do the things we want to do. It's all really possible. It's not like some weird fantasy off in the, it's all really possible. We just have to have the understanding and political will and legal rules to do it. Yeah.
I was going to say on the legal side, I think as a practical matter, given the current jurisprudence on the First Amendment, everything you said is right. But if you actually look at the test, there is a commercial speech doctrine. It's just that the court has chosen to not apply it, which is why you get to courts only sort of saying regulations allowed if the speech was false or misleading. But that isn't how they have to be deciding, they just are. So call to action to our young lawyers that, we also could be engaged. It was very much an effort on behalf of a variety of industries that pushed the court to go to the direction it is now. There is a potential future, maybe not tomorrow, but where courts actually really look at restrictions on speech and whether there's actually a government interest behind them that can kind of surpass that. So and that's our call to action.
Direct-to-consumer drug advertising.
Yes.
Which is also
totally.
Yes, another one that, great.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This was so great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.